Hello! I just got back from seeing Captain America Civil War, and I know that there are probably going to be millions and millions and millions of review videos like this one, but I figured, why the hell not? I have thoughts. Might as well put them out there. It is late at night, and I am still slightly buzzed, so I have no idea how non-rambly this will be, but hey, I just felt like getting some thoughts out there, and I need to generate some content for this channel anyway, so... Spoilers. So, first, right off the top, I really enjoyed this movie. There were so many things that they were trying to do with this movie, so many things that could have gone wrong, and they did such a good job of handling so many different elements. Specifically, I think the biggest concern that most people had going into this movie was they've announced a ton of different superheroes that were going to be in this movie. Superheroes that were already established, new ones that they were introducing, like Black Panther and Spider-Man, and in terms of the pacing and giving everyone a good amount of screen time, making them feel relevant to the plot without completely overtaking it, they did such an excellent job of that. I never felt like they lingered too long on a character that they didn't need to, and at the same time they did a great job of justifying the presence of all the characters, it felt like. Specifically, I really have to applaud them for their integration of Spider-Man, because in a single line they called back to the history of the character that most people watching this movie already know, so they don't need to do a whole rehash of the origin story. I think they even sort of lampshaded that when, like I think Tony asked him, like, why are you doing this at one point? And he starts to go into the origin story, and he starts to be like, well, it's because... And then Tony immediately diverts attention to something else, which I got a little chuckle from that. But they gave him this line, which I won't be able to remember verbatim because I've only watched the movie once, where he essentially was talking about how, I think he says it in the second person, when you have abilities like these and you don't use them when you could, and bad stuff happens, that's your fault. And that's a very oversimplified version of it, but in that single line he calls back to the Uncle Ben origin story, and also, again, justifies his presence in this movie, because the whole movie is about, we superheroes have these abilities, and if we... How are we supposed to use them? Do they need to be regulated by the government, or is it something that we should be able to be left to our own devices to regulate, because we're the ones who understand them the best? We're not necessarily going to be able to account for if we need to be able to respond as quickly as possible if situations arise that only we can deal with. Vision sort of brings up an element that I thought was, in a way, it connects to something that they brought up in The Dark Knight. The fact that, I think Alfred has the line, "You became this thing, this hero," and that sort of unleashed people who would rise to oppose you. Again, oversimplification of it, and probably not the best way of putting it. I'm just sort of going with whatever's going on in my head right now. But Vision has a similar line talking about that, how he even specifically references it's starting with Tony revealing himself to be Iron Man. And he quickly says, I'm not saying that we're the cause of this, but that it's that... Well, that was one thing I did kind of have an issue with, because they ask him, so you're saying there's a connection? And he says, I'm saying that there is a causality. And we could go into the whole argument of correlation versus causality and that sort of stuff, but I was willing to go along with them enough, considering how much stuff they had to do. It was enough to put it out there, and while I don't necessarily agree with the idea that, okay, you create superheroes, that's going to cause supervillains to come about. This is also a fantasy world. There are superheroes in the real world, and there's enough evidence there to support it with... I'm willing to suspend my disbelief there. And again, there's so much other stuff that they're trying to tackle in this movie that to have a deeper, nuanced discussion about that, it probably would... The movie probably would have suffered for it. It probably would have slowed the pacing down a little bit, which again, one of the things I really appreciated about this movie is the pacing, and I think that's something that the Captain America movies, in general, in superhero movies in general, but specifically when it comes to the Marvel movies, I think that the Captain America movies have done such a great job at establishing a good sense of pacing, where you have these big action centerpieces that, how true this is or not is up to debate, but the studio believes that, okay, there is a large portion of this audience that is coming for these big action scenes. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that is, I do think that is a realistic thing to be concerned about. Like, it's a superhero movie. People are going to want to see fight scenes. I personally don't necessarily think that's something to... I really worry about them shoehorning action scenes into stuff. I haven't seen the newest Fantastic Four movie, but I think that was one of the criticisms that was made, was that, like, just from the original trailer, you could see they were going for a sci-fi horror type thing, and then, like, a few months before the release date, they talk about, oh, they announced reshoots for the Fantastic Four, and from what I can tell, just from, admittedly from hearsay and stuff, because I haven't seen the movie, they were shooting more action scenes to make it a more exciting movie, and again, not having seen the movie, I can't really say whether or not that was the sole cause. Maybe there was more issues with the plot than just that, but I can see how that would lead to a less than adequate movie, because the original vision was not what the studio wanted, and that clash, you can see it in so many movies that failed, which I will not get into here, because this is a review of Civil War. And again, the pacing in Civil War, I think they did a fantastic job of pacing those action scenes, and not, like, pacing the movie in general between the dramatic moments and the more actiony superhero blockbuster moments, and also keeping the actiony moments interesting by having these little bits of character shine through, whether it was for a dramatic purpose or for a humorous purpose. Like, people talk about how, like, the Marvel movies are just funnier than DC movies, and the comics are just funnier than DC movies, and it's like, that's not necessarily an inaccurate comparison, but I think the reason I appreciate that sense of humor in Marvel movies so much is not just because it's a way to lighten the mood, but Stan Lee talked about on an episode of the Nerdist podcast how humor is a part of life. People crack jokes and have senses of humor and stuff, and so to ignore that is to ignore part of the human experience. I'm not saying that DC movies or any other superhero movies need to have jokes every 5 seconds because, oh, it's part of the human experience, but I do think that there are movies that suffer from not being willing to throw in a joke here or there, or that makes sense, or not being willing to break the tension with some lighter stuff. Fio and I just recently talked about this in our Penny Dreadful episode of our podcast, Matter of Taste, how this is and this is not in a superhero context, but in a horror context, a show like Penny Dreadful could very easily become very grim and bleak throughout. And there are very dark moments in that show, but the show never feels exhaustingly bleak like some horror movies do, because they're able to have these human moments, these lighter moments, these dramatic moments that aren't necessarily happy or humorous moments, but they connect to the human condition in a way where it's just like, okay, yes, this is a horror show, but we also care about these characters in terms of who they are as people. And I think that's one of the things that, it's not just the humor in the Marvel movies, but they do really, they think about the humanity of these characters, and that's something that I really appreciate about them. And again, I don't want to, like, dogpile on DC because of this, especially because I haven't seen Man of Steel, I haven't seen Batman vs. Superman, so I haven't seen any of the newer DC Universe movies, but the general consensus that I see is that the DC movies and the DC Universe in general and the more recent comic line has been fairly bleak and grim in an effort to be dark and gritty, and it's such a, not disappointment isn't the word I'm looking for, but it's sad to see it because DC has such a wealth of material to draw from, but they don't seem to be able to figure out how to execute it the best way. It seems like, I was just talking about this with my friend Andy because I went and saw the movie, I went and saw Civil War with him. DC, I can understand where the logic comes from, where they might be like, oh, Marvel movies are lighter, they're owned by Disney, so we need to be dark and gritty to tap into that crowd and set ourselves apart. But dark and gritty does not a good movie make. You can make movies that are dark and gritty and still have a sense of humanity to them. That's the thing that set the Christopher Nolan movies apart from so many other superhero movies. Is it's not just that they were a gritty, realistic take on the Batman story, it's that they were concerned with the character arc of Batman, of Alfred, of Rachel even, of these characters, and how ultimately it always came back to that emotional story. The most compelling, I talk about this all the time whenever we talk about gritty and dark stuff or whatever, but the most compelling scene for me in The Dark Knight is the interrogation scene. And it's not because it's this dark, gritty scene, it's because there's this moment of connection, this human connection that Batman and the Joker don't really have with anyone else, but they have with each other, and that's so interesting because they're outliers, they're on the outside. That's a tangent though. Getting back to Civil War. But it's not a complete tangent because it is something to consider when it comes to the superhero genre in general, is that when you have these powers and when you work on a level that's outside the norm, that's going to isolate you from other people. And you see that in Civil War in the way that Scarlet Witch is isolated, rightly or wrongly, because of her powers and her control over them, or lack thereof. The worries that even she has about her own powers. Again, you could have a huge discussion about whether those fears are justified. Her own fears about herself, the other, like, the government's fears about the superheroes. I love that they bring those things up in the movies, and it's enough to bring them up and have discussions about them. They don't need to come to specific conclusions. In fact, if they came to specific conclusions of, oh yeah, superheroes are bad, or oh, then they need to be regulated, or oh, superheroes need to have freedom entirely, then it wouldn't be as interesting to me. I think that was one of the biggest strengths about the ending of that movie, is the fact that at the end of the day, it's not resolved with a happy ending. Nobody died, but Hummelt, I think that's his name, the sort of villain character, and I'll get into that later. You're left to, I think they did a great job of leaving it up to audience interpretation whether or not he succeeded in what he was trying to do. And ultimately, what he was trying to do was to disrupt the Avengers, to take them down from the inside. And there's an argument to be made that, yeah, he did that, especially with the way that that final fight between Captain America, Iron Man, and the Winter Soldier, where the Winter Soldier is actually taken out pretty early on, so it ends up being really between Tony and Steve. And it's so great because at that point it's not about the government stuff at all. It is, but it's not. Like, for them, it's just become so personal, and I think you'd be hard pressed to, like, I'm sure there are people that will still come out on one side or the other, but from a literary perspective, I think they did a really great job of being like, neither of them really come out of this in a really good light. And I love the fact that they were willing to go that far with the story. It, in a sense, that is a really dark place to leave the story, without it being this bleak, gritty thing. There is a bleakness to it, but there's so much else going on in that world with these characters and stuff that it's such. I just appreciated the way they ended that movie so much, because they could have very easily just tied it up in a nice bow, and they didn't, and I have so much respect for them for that. There's also an argument that they could have gone further with it. One of the characters could have died or something, but again, I think going into the movie, I was kind of hoping that they would kill off a character, not because I dislike any of the characters, and I know from an audience perspective I would have been heartbroken if one of the characters had died, but again, from a literary perspective, not to be too pretentious, like, oh, you need death for it to really be literary, but there is something to be said about a major death showing the stakes and elevating a story to a different level. That said, having seen the entire movie, I respect the fact that they didn't kill off a character, and I think the story, honestly, is better off for it. Because that could have very easily created a very definitive ending of like, oh, we should be regulated. That is, like, you know what? Tony was right. Or, in another direction, oh, if only the government hadn't pulled on the chains too much, then none of this would have happened.